over to page 103, and then we have another very important idea. We're going to now have to talk about what if the base number is negative? What if the base number is negative? For example, what if you had -1 and we try to take the square root of -1, and then what if we try to take the cube root of -1? Are these the same? Take your calculator, give it a -1, and hit the square root button. What does it do?
Error.
It says error. In other words, what the calculator is telling you is you can't take the square root of a negative number. The reason you can't is because it's saying what number squared would equal a negative. What number squared, what number could you square that would equal a -1? Can you think of anything you can square and get -1? Because if you square a positive, you're going to get positive. If you square a negative, you're going to get a positive. You can't get a -1. That's why you can't have a square root of a -1 in the real number system. Now, in the very next section, we're going to have a square root of a -1 using imaginary numbers I. We'll get to that next, but you'll have to hang on to that thought for just a while. Yeah, it's imaginary. It's like somebody's imagination was working overtime and they came up with a way to do a square root of a -1. Yes, they did. They made a definition, just like we always do. If we want to do something, we can't do it, we just make up a definition to go along with it. And then we get a bunch of theorems that go along with that definition. Now, how about the cube root of -1? Take -1 and do cube root of -1. Is there, in your head, can you think of anything you could cube and get -1? You could cube -1. -1 cubed would give you -1, wouldn't it? So the cube root of -1 is -1. What if I ask for the fourth root of -1? In other words, I'm saying, what can you raise to the fourth power and get -1? Can I take -1 to the fourth power? Would that give you -1? No. That doesn't work, does it? So what number can you raise to the fourth power and get negative? The answer is none. How about the fifth root of -1? Now, if you took the fifth root of -1, that would be -1. So in other words, here's the principle that I'm showing you. If you have -1 to an odd root, then an odd root, it's -1. An even root, it's no real solution. No real solution. Okay? So now, here's my next thought. As we move into a problem such as number 26. 26 says, what is -27 to the 1/3 power? Well, what does the 1/3 power mean? Cube root. So we can take the cube root of -27, can't we? Can we take the cube root of a negative?
Yes.
No, you can't.
Cube root, yes.
Oh, yeah.
It would be -3, right? The cube root of a negative is a negative number, okay? So how would you check that? Let's say you're not sure. Say, well, I'm not sure about that. How do you know for sure? We don't want to guess at this thing, you know. So we take -3 and cube it and see if you get back the -27. That's the check. -3 cubed would be -27. So that checks, doesn't it? Okay? Now, what if I had said -16 to the 1/2 power? With parentheses. With parentheses. Now, what would that say? The 1/2 power means what?
16 squared.
Square root of
-4.
-16. And what would you say?
That'd be positive. -4.
You can't take a square root of a negative number in the real numbers, can you? No real solution. No real solution. Okay? No real solution. However, what if I give you that same problem? What if I give you that same problem without parentheses? -16 to the 1/2 power. No parentheses now. What's the important question I need to ask? What is raised to the 1/2 power?
6.
What is it that's raised to the 1/2 power? Only the 16, right? Only the 16, not the negative. You see, you have to think of that as a -1 times. -1 times 16 to the 1/2 power. So the only thing that is going to be in the square root is the 16. And what happens with that negative out in front? It stays in front of the radical. The negative is actually outside the radical. So what's the answer going to be? Negative 4. Okay? Negative 4 is the answer. Negative 4. Any questions on that? Okay? Now, look over to number 43 and number 44 as a pair of problems. Number 43 and number 44. Number 43, it says negative 27 to the 2/3 power. And as a parallel problem to that, I'd like to work this one, number 44, which says negative 27 to the 2/3 power without parentheses. Do you see a difference here? In the first case, what root do I take? I should say, what's the base number? The base number is negative 27, and then the root is cube root, so I'm going to have to take the cube root of the negative 27 and then raise it to the second power, like that? Okay? Before I even finish that, let's check this one out. What is the base number? 27, not the negative. You see, the negative is separate. So I've got to keep that negative separate, and then I'm going to have the cube root of the 27, and it's going to be all raised to the second power, isn't it? Do you see the difference there in the way it's set up? So what's the answer to the first one? Negative 3 squared, which would be 9. Okay? The answer is 9. And for the second one, the answer will be negative, and then it'll be 3 squared, which would be actually negative 9, right? Negative 9. So you get 9, you get negative 9. Okay? Right? And remember, you've still got your calculator in your hand, don't you? How would you do that with a calculator? 27 negative. Now I'll tell you what, I got to warn you about some of these calculators are going to work, and some of the calculators are going to not work when you have a negative base number. I think you're going to have to try these with your calculator to see how far you're going to be able to go in this assignment with the calculators. Some calculators work very nicely, and some of them will just mess you up because you see, if you give the calculator a decimal value like 2/3 is 0.66666, it doesn't recognize that as being even power of the numerator and odd root of the denominator. It just recognizes it as a decimal. So a lot of the calculators do not work when you have a negative base number. So what do you do with a calculator? You work it out with a positive base number, and then you have to figure out what the sign is or whether it even exists. So here's what I do if I wanted to use a calculator. I'd go ahead and do it with a calculator with the positive base number, and then I would figure out, based upon the base number being negative, whether there's an answer or whether there's not an answer, and if there's an answer, whether it's positive answer or negative answer. For example, number 54, the very last one in the assignment, number 54, number 54, it says negative 64 raised to the negative 1/2 power. Okay? Using my method, doing it in my head, what's the base number?
Negative 64.
Negative 64. And what's the root?
Square. 2.
The 2 gives you the square root of negative 62. And then we're going to raise it to the what? Negative 1 power. You see how we work that? Now, can you do the square root of negative 64? Not the real numbers, right? So the answer here would be no real solution. Because the calculator can't do the square root of a negative 64. And I might add, neither can you. All right? Because if I said, what is the square root of negative 64, I'm saying, what number can I square that would give me negative 64? What real number can you square that would give you a negative 64? A positive number? No. A negative number? No. And not 0. And that's it for the real numbers, so there's no real solution. Any questions on that? Okay? All right, I think that concludes the assignment for today, and then the next assignment is going to be complex numbers. So